Well, hello, everyone. Okay, just adjusting myself here. All right, woo. I'm gonna adjust myself over here. All right, well, hello, everyone. It's your girl Gabrielle. Welcome to a brand new episode of Hot Topics. If you are new to the show, let me tell you what the show is about. If you are returning to the show, whether you're watching this in real time or on the replay, I'm just going to remind you what the show is about. So, this is a show that aims to educate you. So, this is kind of educational programming in a way. I like to take a variety of different topics and explore things using an educational lens. So you could think of this as a teaching moment in a way, as this podcast is a part of my company, A Step Ahead Tutoring Services. This is to teach you some things. So you're going to learn something today. And I am excited about today. And I know I say that in every episode, but today I am excited because not only do I have a repeat guest, I have a repeat topic. So let me tell you what that repeat topic is. So that repeat topic is what is schizophrenia, part two. So there's a part one, of course. You know, you can listen to part one. It's out on video right now. This will eventually be on audio, depending on when you listen to this episode. So check out part one of what is schizophrenia. So we're going to continue the conversation about what is schizophrenia, and we're going to get into more about the history of schizophrenia, how it became recognized, and also we're going to get into the portrayal of schizophrenia in pop culture, in movies, and TV. So we're definitely going to get into that today. And the person who's going to help me out, who is actually returning to the hot seat, her name is Sarah Gallup. She was in part one and now she's back for part two. And let me just remind you about who she is. So, Sarah Gallup is a licensed psychologist at a forensic state hospital, and she's the host of the new podcast, Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospital. That is her podcast, which we will mention in the promo later today. All right. So, without further ado, I am going to bring Sarah to the stage. Hey, Sarah, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, welcome back to the hot seat. So, we are going to get into it. We had a riveting conversation last time about what is schizophrenia. We talked about positive symptoms, negative symptoms. So, if you could just just to what's the word, to do a quick review,
Mhm.
right? So when it comes to like in a classroom, there's always the review, right?
Yes,
So
indeed.
let's
Yes,
let's
indeed.
let's do a quick review
Little
of
recap here.
what a recap. Yes, a recap. What is schizophrenia?
Yeah, so last week we briefly talked about how schizophrenia is really, in many ways, a misunderstood diagnosis. We talked about positive and negative symptoms, and one of the things I mentioned was that positive symptoms are something that are added to somebody who, it's not normally there. So positive symptoms, not in the sense of like they're really good, but they've been added on. So visual, auditory hallucinations, tactile hallucinations, olfactory hallucinations, delusions are all examples excuse me, of symptoms that wouldn't be in somebody who doesn't have schizophrenia. Whereas negative symptoms are talking about things that aren't there, that aren't present, that should be present. For instance, we should have like an emotional expression on our faces, and so often with people with schizophrenia, they lack the emotional expressions on our faces that the rest of us have. Sometimes there's a motivation or a volition, which is not really wanting to get out of bed or do anything. It can look a lot like depression. Um, anhedonia would be another negative symptoms. They're not finding pleasure in anything. They don't want to do the things they usually enjoy. So you can see how schizophrenia is really a complex disorder because it overlaps so much with other diagnoses. So there's a lot that looks like depression. There's a lot that looks like anxiety. There's a lot that looks like PTSD. There's a lot that looks like ADHD because of the attention and concentration difficulties. And so, really, when we're looking at schizophrenia, there's a lot that goes into it. Schizophrenia is a cognitive degenerative disease. And so, one of the unfortunate side effects of schizophrenia is that a lot of people will actually start to lose brain matter and will have cognitive deficits as they get older, and so they'll show signs similar to dementia more quickly than other people might.
Thank you. Thank you
Mhm.
for that beautiful recap. So now we're gonna get more into um, the history of schizophrenia, right? And as
Yeah.
well as its portrayal in pop culture. So
Hmm.
let's get into the history of schizophrenia. Please tell us about
Yeah.
that.
Absolutely. Well, schizophrenia is it's really fascinating. There have been evidence, or there has been evidence of schizophrenia occurring in people as long ago as like the ancient Egyptians. I would argue that there's evidence in Christian texts of schizophrenia and people being what they would say would be possessed by demons. To me, looks a lot like schizophrenia. And I can't say obviously one way or another, but that's what that looks like. So it could be, like I said, as old as the ancient Egyptians. And before it was even called schizophrenia, there was a doctor named Dr. Emil Kraepelin who identified what he called dementia praecox in 1887. Um, Dementia, we know, is the dementing process is less and less cognitive abilities. Praecox simply means premature. So he identified this as a premature form of dementia, recognizing the cognitive aspects, the cognitive deteriorations that occurred. As we know today, the cognitive problems aren't the only aspect of schizophrenia that's problematic. We also have the positive and negative symptoms that factor into that. But for a long time, and in my podcast, Behind the Walls, I talk a lot about dementia praecox in the old asylums because that's how people came in and were diagnosed. And so we saw that for a long time. Around the turn of the century in 1911, there was a Swiss psychiatrist named Dr. Eugen Bleuler. I think that's how you say it. He was the first one who called dementia praecox schizophrenia. And so schizo comes from the Greek, which means split. And phrene comes from the Greek, which means mind. So a split mind is what we have here. So Dr. Bleuler was also the first person who not only coined the term schizophrenia, but also he was the first person to describe those positive and negative symptoms that we just talked about. Um, so really, he had a very significant effect on the history of diagnosing and the history of how this was treated in the hospitals. Somewhere around 1980, actually, I think it was in 1980, the DSM-3 came out, and the DSM-3, we talked a little bit last week about the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. It's sort of our um, it's our main text for describing all of the mental health disorders. And in 1980, they had a pretty significant revision. PTSD was added for the first time, and then schizophrenia and different types of schizophrenia were also added to that. So there's what we called paranoid schizophrenia, disorganized schizophrenia, catatonic schizophrenia, and undifferentiated schizophrenia. And so each of those different types had slightly different symptoms. Obviously, in paranoid schizophrenia, you get more of the paranoid and delusional aspects. So people beliefs that people are following you, trying to kill you, stealing from you. manipulating your body in some way. I've a lot of people that believe that somebody was putting chips, like microchips, into their brain or into their neck or into other parts of their body to like communicate with them. And disorganized schizophrenia looks a lot more like the negative symptoms. So this is somebody who's acting strange. Maybe they're spinning around in circles. They're not engaging socially like they maybe should be. And then catatonic is really a strange form of schizophrenia, because that's where somebody really has no affect. I mean, there's no emotional expression on their faces. They may not do a whole lot. Sometimes people with catatonia have really strange movements, or they just get sort of fixed in a position and it looks very odd. So a lot of people will say, oh, this person, they're acting very oddly. Often it's difficult for those folks to get out of bed. Undifferentiated schizophrenia just kind of meant that maybe you didn't quite fit all in one box, but you still showed the main symptoms. In the DSM-5, which is, well, now we have the DSM-5 revised version as of 2022. We got rid of all the labels, and now it's just schizophrenia. And so if somebody has a diagnosis of schizophrenia, they may have these symptoms, they might have those symptoms. And so that's, it's kind of, we clumped it all together rather than splitting these people off into this group and these people off into this group. And I think that helps to simplify the process. It's easier for patients to talk about their diagnoses if they just have the one schizophrenia diagnosis and showing these symptoms and that symptom. Yeah, I mean, in terms of history, schizophrenia is really one of the more, I hate to say modern, but one of the newer diagnoses. Prior to Dr. Kraepelin talking about dementia praecox in 1887, we referred more to melancholia, which is depression, or mania, which might be a part of bipolar disorder. And so anyway, that's sort of a brief overview on the history of schizophrenia. But one of the things I wanted to come back to, and we alluded to briefly, was the sort of what I'll call a misnomer of schizophrenia being a split mind. I don't necessarily think that that's the best term to describe this diagnosis. One of the problems that happens and has happened over time is that a lot of movies will misrepresent schizophrenia, and they'll portray it more as what we used to call multiple personality disorder, which is now dissociative identity disorder. And these are two, I think I may have briefly mentioned this in the last episode, I can't recall. They're actually found in two different sections of the DSM. So schizophrenia is obviously going to be in the schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders section. So this is where we're focusing on psychosis. And then multiple personality disorder, or dissociative identity disorder, we now call it, is in the trauma section. So there's really a different etiology for both of these. Dissociative identity disorder, I actually don't know if I've ever worked with somebody with DID, at least not that I've been aware of. It definitely is a trauma-based disorder. We don't surprisingly see it a lot in the state hospitals. I think it's probably, it's, for a lot of people, it's more easily treatable out in the community, but I don't think I've ever worked with it. However, I've worked with a lot of folks with schizophrenia. I'm trying to think of a few movies, and Gabrielle, maybe you could think of some too, of movies that portray schizophrenia. And the movie Split comes to mind. It came out a few years ago. I actually haven't seen it, but just based on what I heard about it and the trailers that I saw for it, it seemed like it was more in the wheelhouse of multiple personality disorder. Are you familiar with that movie?
With Split. Oh, that's
Split.
the
I think it was
M.
I
Night
think it was an M. Night
Shyamalan movie.
Shyamalan movie.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I'm familiar with that one.
Yeah.
Well, just to thank you for the history,
Yeah.
by the way.
Yeah.
I just wanted to
It was a lot.
throw that in there. You definitely provided a lot of background, and I'm glad you mentioned the religious
Hmm.
aspect, the religious portrayal, because so I just wanted to throw this in here, but
Hmm.
I'm glad that you brought that up because it you it's very common in the in Christianity,
Hmm.
particularly Catholicism, that you have people who are possessed by demons,
Hmm.
and um, you it's it it's often confused with
Hmm.
schizophrenia, right?
Right.
And I mean, I'm not a Catholic, but I am Christian,
Hmm.
and it, I mean, it takes a priest, a clergyman to to tell to be able to tell the difference between someone who's if we actually who is actually possessed by demons,
Right.
and who actually has schizophrenic symptoms. So
Hmm.
so I'm glad that you brought that up, that
Yeah.
it's commonly confused in Christianity, those two different things.
Absolutely. We
So I'm
even
glad
have
that,
with some of our
yeah.
testing materials, we have one particular scale that talks about it's sort of based on schizophrenia symptoms, and we have to be careful because a lot of the questions that are designed to look for paranoia or delusions are actually can also be religiously affiliated. And so if somebody scores a little bit higher on that section, we need to sort of differentiate, clinically speaking, if that person is actually showing symptoms of like psychosis, or are they actually, is this normative religious beliefs or behavior? And you know, if somebody were to say, oh, I talk to angels every day, is that psychotic? Is that religious? And so that's something that's can be really difficult to tease out sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, and we're gonna get to the pop culture. I just wanted
Okay.
to throw this in here, but and I think now I may be wrong about this, but I think now in like the archdiocese, I think now they're actually consulting psychiatrists
Hmm.
and,
That's a good
and
question. I don't
doctors
know.
now when they do their exorcisms. So
Hmm.
um so I think they're factoring that in now.
Okay.
I think I don't quote me on that,
Sure.
but I
I
think
don't know either.
now don't quote me on that, but I've heard or I've seen somewhere, but and when they go out when they do their exorcisms, they're now consulting psychiatrists and
Hmm.
doctors to make sure that it's not actually schizophrenia, but it actually is possession. So
Hmm. It makes
so
sense.
I'm glad you brought up that religious aspect.
Yeah.
All right, back to pop culture.
Okay.
Okay, so I did see Splits. Um, I don't. I vaguely remember that movie, but I think my understanding of dissociative identity disorder, it's it's sort of like the patient is becoming other people. So I
Hmm.
think the difference between schizophrenia and DID, I think schizophrenia is more of like I see other people or other people are talking to me,
Hmm.
as opposed to like you with DID, you are becoming a completely different person.
Yeah.
So it's like a transformation, so to
Yeah.
speak. You are transforming yourself into different um maybe different personalities, and each personality represents some sort of characteristic. So you
Hmm.
have the tough person, the sad person, the protector, so it's like you have these characteristics, and each characteristic is a person, and then that you're becoming each person depending on the situation that you're in. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I'm certainly not an expert in DID, but what I've learned about it is that and I'm a firm believer, I take a trauma-informed perspective on this. So I'm a believer that DID forms from trauma, probably from like early lifetime. Our brains do a really fantastic job of trying to protect ourselves when we're experiencing trauma. And so one of the ways that it can, um, there's a little bit of an echo. I got distracted by my own thoughts. One of the things that it can do is the brain can essentially fragment off, and it can try to cope with the stressors by sort of going into a safe place. And so my understanding of DID is that, there are different aspects. You could be in sort of like a warmer, cozier part of your place, and then the aspects of you that are angry and traumatized can be in a different part. And so that's sort of my understanding of it. And it really gets quite exaggerated in the media. It's not, I don't think it's super common that people will actually completely fragment off and dress as one person and go by a particular identity, and then something will happen and then they'll dress a different way and talk a different way. I think that's maybe somewhat exaggerated, but it is true that our brains try really hard and are very good at protecting ourselves from the trauma that we experience. And sometimes it just kind of happens that we fragment off in different places. But that is something that's different than schizophrenia. Schizophrenia does not necessarily have, or folks with schizophrenia don't necessarily have multiple personalities, so to speak. The
Right.
voices that they're hearing aren't separate personalities.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So back to the pop culture.
Yeah.
Okay. So I vaguely remember Split. I'm thinking of A Beautiful Mind
Yes, that's another one
with
that's
Russell
really.
Crowe. Yeah, so that one is a positive depiction of it, but my recollection of, like, he was a teacher, I
Mm-hmm.
think, and all of a sudden, like, Paul Bettany, like, he
Mm-hmm.
started coming around,
Right.
and Paul Bettany is one of the hallucinations.
Spoiler
And
alert. Just kidding.
spoiler alert, sorry. No, the movie is like 30 years
I
old.
know.
But
If you
anyway,
haven't seen it by now, it's not.
there's a spoiler, there's a rule, there's a 5-year rule. Um, but yeah, Paul Bettany is one of the hallucinations,
Mm-hmm.
and um I guess he's talking. Oh yeah, and then he it's I'm trying to remember, but I'm not sure if it was him, but he got him like in a car and like driving, and he was
Mm-hmm.
committing all these crimes, I think. And his wife was like, "You're doing all this stuff," and he's I think he's like, he's an important investigator and he's helping an investigation, and
Mm-hmm.
the wife was like, "That's not real."
Right.
And Russell Crowe's character was like, "Yeah, it is real," and the wife's like, "No, it's not." And I think he just didn't believe it. And then I think he just came to some realization. He realized, like, all the people that he was talking to,
Mm-hmm.
they never grew old. They say they
Mm-hmm.
stayed the same age. And so
Yeah.
he saw that, he made that realization. He was like, "Oh, these people don't grow up, so they can't be real." And he's looking
Is
at his
there
wife.
a little girl in there too? It's been a
Yeah,
while.
as a little girl.
Little girl or a little, yeah, little girl. Yeah.
Yeah.
That movie, I mean, it's a beautiful movie. It was very well done. Obviously there was a lot that they had to embellish for the sake of
Yeah.
um a movie,
Mhm.
because John Nash, the psychiatrist, or the what was he, the professor in that movie, Russell Crowe's character,
Yeah.
yes, he had schizophrenia, but he actually never saw visual hallucinations. I think I mentioned last week, the visual hallucinations are actually quite rare. And so if somebody does say that they're experiencing visual hallucinations, that's sort of a red flag for us. And then we tend to probe a little bit further into what they're experiencing if they're saying they have visual hallucinations. So John Nash primarily had auditory hallucinations, paranoia, and delusions, which are really the most common aspects of schizophrenia. But one of the things that they chose to do stylistically for the film was it would be hard to create a movie with the main character experiencing auditory hallucinations because obviously nobody else around them can hear it. And so Paul Bettany's character was the sort of physical manifestation of the auditory hallucinations he was experiencing. And so I think stylistically for the film, it was a really good choice because as viewers, we didn't know the whole time that it wasn't real until the very end. And so I thought it really did a nice job of sort of externalizing his symptoms in a way that made sense in terms of cinematography. There was a similar issue in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where similarly the main character, who's the chief, he's this tall indigenous guy. He has auditory hallucinations and command hallucinations throughout the book, and the book was written from his perspective so that we get sort of an insider's glimpse into the hallucinations that he's having, but it's not really conducive to storytelling in a movie form. And so what they ended up doing in the film was basically getting rid of his hallucinations altogether, and the big chief just became sort of a side character where he's the main narrator in the book, and we see the whole story through his cracked lens, so to speak. But in the movie, it really shifts the focus more to Jack Nicholson's character, who's the larger than life anarchical figure. And so that, you know, it's interesting what you can do writing a book versus making a movie. You can't always tell the same story the same way, which is good and bad.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay,
Can you hear
sorry.
me?
There's a little note that popped up on my mic. Anyway,
Oh, whoops.
yeah. I think it's like with trying to remember, I don't really remember one floor of the Cuckoo's Nest, but with Beautiful Mind, I remember there I don't think there was talk about medication, but
I don't remember. There probably was. Certainly at some point.
yeah. But I remember like in the movie um John Nash, like he was teaching at the end
Mm-hmm.
and a student came up to him and he was like, can I talk? No, or I think like a random cop came into this classroom and wanted to talk to him. And then he asked one of his students, and do you see him? And the student said, yeah, I see him. So
Gotta double
and he's
check.
like, okay, so I know that you're real, right?
Right,
So
right.
that was I remember that part of the movie because I was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, he's checking to see
Yeah.
if this hallucination was real. So he acknowledged his hallucinations, he acknowledged his illness, and
Right.
he's implementing a coping strategy,
Mm-hmm.
right?
We call it
Um,
reality testing.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yes,
We
I
encourage
remember
our
that
patients
part.
to use it. They're not always very good at it.
Yeah. So I think like that was a positive depiction of it. And I think just generally speaking, when it comes to the way it's portrayed in schizophrenia, it's always like there's like positive portrayal and there's negative portrayal. So I think when it comes to maybe in movies, it leans more on the positive side. In that they think they're on a quest or they think
Mm-hmm.
they're on some kind of investigation and they're trying to save the world, and then there's always someone that comes in and says all this is not real.
Right.
Right,
Right.
and then they have to come to terms with that. I think more on the TV side, I think it tends to be more negative.
Interesting.
I'm just thinking, I mean, this is my. I'm just thinking like
Mm-hmm.
I've seen Law and Order, so many Law and Order episodes, and they like they're usually the perpetrator, and they kill somebody, and they say, "Oh, the voices told me to do it."
Mm-hmm.
So so they're usually like the ones committing the crimes,
Right.
right? Um, so tell me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting. I've never thought about that before. But I obviously like to share stories with my patients about people who have had schizophrenia and who have succeeded. People who, there are plenty of people. We have lots of celebrities who struggle with bipolar disorder, personality disorders, depression, anxiety, right? And are still succeeding despite all of those things. And so, um, I also like to share the folks that have been able to live a good life with schizophrenia. And so there's, oh, I'm forgetting his name now. There was a football player for somewhere in the Midwest. I'm not very good with football, but he was a well-known football player who had schizophrenia, and so we talk about him and his struggles with it. And it's been a while, clearly, since I've talked about it, but it's a good lesson for them that even though they have a mental illness, they can still live a good life. They can still succeed, in spite of it. And there's also a YouTube channel that I really enjoy. It's a gal who has schizoaffective disorder, and she talks about her experiences having schizoaffective disorder. She talks about her symptoms, and uh, what it's like to live with the disorder and how it kind of interferes with her life. And she was able to get married, have kids, start this YouTube channel, and be successful. And so I think that's really helpful to my patients, to learn that people can live good lives with it. In terms of like the TV portrayal, like you were talking about, I haven't watched a lot of Law and Order. My mom
Or in
does.
general, any kind of
Yeah, or Criminal
show, yeah.
Minds, or any of those sorts of
Yeah,
shows.
Criminal Minds is another one, yeah.
Yeah, where there generally is this very stigmatized portrayal of folks with schizophrenia, that they have, that they're very dangerous or inherently dangerous, which isn't necessarily true. I know I talked a little bit last week about how, if somebody is unhoused and has schizophrenia, they're going to be naturally a little bit more paranoid because they're vulnerable. They're on the streets, they're vulnerable. There are real risks to living out on the streets. Their guard is going to be up more than those of us who can lock our doors at night, and close our windows. And so a lot of those paranoid symptoms just kind of escalate when somebody is unhoused. It escalates even more if they're using substances and alcohol. And that can really be a recipe for disaster. It's more often, and I don't have statistics to back this up, this is more just an anecdotal, observational idea, is that it seems to me that drugs and alcohol are far more likely to affect somebody and cause them to be dangerous than the mental illness on its own. If it's treated, our guys at the hospital, often they're doing very well at the hospital. They're sometimes the most stable they've ever been in their lives when they're at the hospital. And there's some folks who, if they're taking their medications, if they are engaging in their treatment, if they have a job, they are not a danger to anybody around them. And so as long as they are following those protocols, they are doing really well. Get them back into the community, and if they start using drugs again, then that becomes a different issue. They go off their medications, then their mental illness can really affect their ability to reality test, if you will. So we have far more guys at low risk of violence at the hospital, than they would be at higher risk out in the community.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on I will say this, particularly with TV shows.
Mm-hmm.
I just know, like, even just thinking about it as you're talking, like with Law and Order and Criminal Minds, it's usually like they're committing a heinous crime, like they're committing murder or they're a serial killer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they get caught, and then they say, "Oh, a voice these voices told me to do it. And then the answer is always, let's medicate them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like at the end of the episode, the answer is always medication,
Mm-hmm.
medication. Um, and not that I'm knocking it, but I just noticed like the answer is always medication. So there's,
Mm-hmm.
it's not like not just medication, but therapy as well, you know, like, or even things like coping mechanisms,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's um I just thinking about it now, like this, the when it comes to the treatment of schizophrenia, particularly in television shows, it's
Mm-hmm.
always medication. It's rarely about medication and doing something else, medication and this, medication and that. It's almost always just strictly get on medication and
Mm-hmm.
that's it. So do you is but I will say this as well. I is a lot. I think now they're showing more realistic portrayals in terms of
I hope so.
what is it, what does it look like being
Right.
on medication, and you see the side effects, and it's and why they get off, you know. So what do you think of what are your thoughts on that in terms of the portrayal of the treatment of schizophrenia in movies and TV?
Yeah. So I have a few thoughts that came to my mind. One is that, on the whole, there's sort of this false narrative of folks with schizophrenia being serial killers or mass murderers or whatever, and that generally isn't true. Um, what I've noticed in my years of working with folks with severe and persistent mental illness is that often um, the the folks who are committing murder, especially multiple murders, and really serious offenses, tend to be higher functioning. They may not have schizophrenia at all. They may be more likely to have bipolar disorder. Um, Schizophrenia, because it is a degenerative brain disease, they're not going to be able to think that clearly ahead, and do the planning that like serial murders requires, essentially, right? They're not going to be able to plan in advance this, that, and the other thing. The folks who commit murder who do have schizophrenia, um, it's generally really impulsive. It's in that moment, and often they see it as like a self-defense. There's more often than not, they think if I don't kill this person, they're going to kill me. And so there's really not a lot of planning involved. They're going to grab whatever is closest to them to defend themselves, just like you would if you were actually being attacked by somebody. And so that's generally what we see for folks with schizophrenia. Um, more often, we're going to see, uh, at least what I noticed when I worked in folks who are incompetent to stand trial. So those are people who've been charged with an offense, but they haven't been sentenced for it or convicted for it yet. So they're in that in between state. Those folks, it's really, really common for people to have um, arson charges, especially if they're unhoused, because they get cold and they light a fire in a dumpster somewhere and they got to stay warm. So they end up with an arson charge. It's also really common for them to get like a battery on a police officer, because if they get, if they're acting strange, somebody calls the police, police show up, and then they feel they need to defend themselves. Or if they start to get arrested, they might get really squirrely and lash out and accidentally harm somebody. So that's what we see on the incompetent side of things. In terms of medication, I have to, I was reminding myself while you were talking that I work with a very small percentage of folks with severe and persistent mental illness. I work with the most severe cases. Generally speaking, the folks I work with, they have to be medicated, because their symptoms are so severe that it's impairing not only their daily life, but it's impairing their ability to live safely in the community. Um, However, having said that, we offer the medications, and it's really important that they know alternatives to alternatives to violence and how to manage their symptoms in non-pharmacological ways. So for a lot of them, music is their lifeline. And so if they're having symptoms, they can put in their headphones and they can sort of drown out the voices. They can drown out the negative thoughts. And that's a really effective way to cope in a non-medicinal way. Other people will exercise or go for a walk or talk to somebody, and that's how they'll cope with their symptoms. People who are in the community may be more likely to need fewer medications, or maybe no medications at all, or a different type of medications. One of the sort of unfortunate things about the folks in my hospital is that, or really any state hospital, is these medications are heavy duty and they have a lot of negative side effects. Some of the stronger ones can cause drooling, and not just like a little bit of drool, but like a lot of drool down the top, the front of their shirt. Sometimes they require droplets to help them manage their drooling, or even Botox injections to help manage the drooling because it can be so severe. Those are really few and far between, even among the patients at my hospital. But a lot of them, they'll have sexual side effects. They'll have weight gain is a common side effect. Sometimes people get the jitters, they get shaky hands. Sometimes we have a symptom called tardive dyskinesia, where usually somebody has some kind of odd facial movements. Sometimes it's a flick of the tongue. Sometimes it's odd blinking, and those can be signs of side effects from the medication. So we want to be really, really, really careful with the medications that we offer, knowing that there could be potentially unpleasant side effects. And we always, whenever, especially the psychiatrist checks in with the patients, they're always asking about any side effects. We do have medications that can help manage those side effects, but often for a lot of our folks, the medications are so unpleasant that when they return to the community, they'll go off them right away because they don't want to keep gaining weight. They don't want to keep having the sexual side effects. They don't want to, keep experiencing this, that, and the other thing. And I can't blame them. There's also often the belief that, hey, I'm doing better now. I don't need my medications. And it's like, well, you're doing better because you're on your medications. So it's a really complex issue. And of course, we encourage our patients to stay on their medications once they leave. And we want them using their alternative coping skills, and recognizing when their symptoms get worse and what makes them get worse and what can help at the same time. So it's really, there's a lot that goes into it. We do a lot of teaching of recognizing what they're feeling in their own body. When I get sick to my stomach or when I get shaky, that means I'm feeling anxious or I'm feeling nervous about something. We do a lot of teaching about that. And so we try to leave them with all the tools that they need in order to be successful. And then once they leave, it's ultimately up to them how much of that they use.
Awesome. Thank you for elaborating on the medication, the effects of the medication. When it comes to the when it comes to movies and television, it's usually just get on medication. Right. That's usually the end goal at the end of the show, after they commit the crime and they get caught and they say, all the voices made me do it, get on medication. But
that's the fastest way.
I'm glad, yeah. But I'm glad you elaborated the reason, the side effects of the medication, and why patients get off it, right? Because of all the side effects, and why it's difficult for them to stay on. So, just I feel like, what do you think, the kind of bringing it back to pop culture, what do you think the effects of the way that it's portrayed in TV shows and movies, that it doesn't really show they don't really show the full picture of schizophrenia, or it's like they leave out the side effects, or the one people with schizophrenia are criminals, right? So what do you think the effect of this message is, in terms of people watching this in movies and TV? What do you think the effects are of, what am I trying to say? What am I trying to ask?
I know what
do
you're
you
saying.
think? What do you think the effects of this type of messaging about schizophrenia? What effect is it having on society?
I think it's a great question, because one of the things that I think it does is it negatively portrays the illness. It is a terrible illness. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. And we get all these wrong ideas about it. People with schizophrenia aren't necessarily more likely to commit mass atrocities. There's also just kind of a lack of understanding. When we're working with TV and film, they're always going to go for the most sensational, right? And so often a lot of the symptoms are exaggerated, the negative consequences are grossly exaggerated. And I was just thinking, if we made a movie about like the very real aspects of schizophrenia that I see from day to day, it would be kind of boring. Because you'd have somebody who is mumbling to himself for a minute, and then he goes to his room and takes a nap, right? That would be essentially what it would look like for 2.5 hours. And then he'd come out for lunch and then go back to his room and take another nap. That's not very exciting for movie and TV. So they often take the real symptoms of schizophrenia, exaggerate them, just like a journalist would do. We're always looking for the most sensational. People are always looking for something that's super dramatic. And so the effect is that we do get this incorrect view of what it actually is, when the reality is, yes, it's a terrible disorder, more so for the individual themselves than for the people around them. I mean, I know there are stats to support this. I just can't recall what they are off the top of my head, but folks with schizophrenia are far more likely to die by suicide than other groups. And it's really unfortunate, because many of the symptoms that they experience they feel a lot like torture. If it happened to any of the rest of us, if we had somebody talking to us incessantly about how stupid we are, how worthless we are, how what you should just die, like all day long, it would be horrible. I mean, that would be a horrific situation, right? Or if we firmly believe that people were out to get us all of the time, it would just be a horrible way to live. And so often these folks are at risk of dying by suicide. And I think I talked a little bit about that last time. So we make sure, part of my job is to make sure that I am evaluating them regularly for their risk of self-harm. Sometimes people will just bash their head into a wall just to try and get the voices to stop, or the thoughts to stop. And so I'm constantly evaluating for suicide risk and self-harm risk. And it's really sad, especially the folks with a more, they're on the severe end of the spectrum. It seems like it would be exhausting. And I have a lot of empathy for them.
Right. And I think it's we need to educate the public more on schizophrenia, because it's people are thinking, oh, they're criminals, right? Whenever you think of schizophrenia, it's, oh, they're criminals, they're committing crimes, they're killing people, right? And because that's what they see in movies, and that's what they see on TV. And I mean, you have the occasional positive outlook, but they're usually some, like, in the middle of committing some kind of crime, right?
Right.
And I think that's a small minority of cases, and I think it's It's they're they're people with schizophrenia. They're usually not the criminals, right? It's usually like a small fraction of them, right? So it's
right. Or they
I think
often get labeled as tweakers because they're behaving oddly and they're using substances. And I go back to what their symptoms are. I mean, if I were experiencing those symptoms, I would probably use drugs to escape them too. And they're really horrible. I hope I wouldn't, but I can't blame the guys who do, because they have to do something to turn that off. And unfortunately, substances are a quick and easy way to do that. And so that's what a lot of them will turn to. And yes, when you mix drugs with disorganized behavior, you get a real mess of a person, and that can lead them to get into trouble. But I dislike when people talk about tweakers, because there's probably so much more going on than just substance abuse.
right. And when they're and especially when they're portrayed in pop culture, they
Oh, I can't hear you now. Mm-mm. Uh-oh.
can hear
No.
me.
Oh, now you're back.
I'm back.
Yes, now you're back.
Okay. Okay.
Dang.
Woo, that's weird. All right. Yeah, I was saying, like, when it like, even with people on drugs, tweakers, it's the way they're portrayed in the media is they're like a menace to society, and they do it to themselves, and
Right.
we're ignoring the trauma, we're ignoring something put them there.
Yeah.
We're ignoring, like, they use it to it's self-medicating, right? They use it to cope with the trauma. So we're ignoring these things, and
Exactly.
then people don't see that.
Yeah, it's a complex. I mean, substance use disorder is a whole different element, but it's more complex than just this person wants to keep using drugs and just doesn't want to stop. It's always, always, always more complex than that.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, let's start to wind things down.
All right.
So now, what final words of wisdom would you like to share? What do you want people to know about schizophrenia?
I think overall, the thing that I would like people to recognize is, it can happen to anybody. And last time we talked about, it happens generally during the late teens and up to mid 20s for both men and women. um, but that I think what I want people to know is that folks with schizophrenia aren't necessarily bad people. I work with a lot of folks who are inherently good people, um, and who are very, very ill. And it's sad to see. I often sort of dream about what their lives could have been like if they didn't have this disease. And a lot of them are really family oriented. A lot of them have goals, and wanted to be more successful than they ended up being, just because of the state of their mental illness. So I think, final words of wisdom, just like with anything, don't make every situation is so different. We have to be aware of our own internal biases when we're approaching these things, and to not make gross generalizations about people.
Right, and definitely just and I would chime in there in terms of television, in terms of movies, be don't what I'm trying to say, like, just be aware of what you're watching. It may not be the full picture.
Absolutely.
It's very embellished, right? They leave a lot of details out, and it may not be a complete depiction of schizophrenia. So I would just throw that in there. So just don't take what
Absolutely.
you see at face value, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. All right. Well, Sarah, thank you again for this conversation. Thank you for
Yeah.
coming back on Hot Topics and highlighting schizophrenia. I think it's a very important topic, and we thank you for helping me educate the public about this.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah. All right, so now it's promo time.
Woohoo.
All right, you guys. So Sarah, you can find Sarah, you guys. She is all over the place. You could find her right, the super secret Facebook group. You would have to reach out to her to get in, but she does have a Facebook group for her podcast. It is called Behind the Walls Podcast. It is a private group, so please message her to get in the group. She is also she has two Instagram accounts. One is Lini Luhu, and the other one is Behind the Walls Pod. So follow her on both of her accounts on Instagram. She is also on TikTok. The account is Dr. Sarah Hyleen. So follow her on TikTok as well. And you can also send her an email, Behind the Walls Podcast at gmail.com. So I encourage you, to my watchers, to my listeners, to my audience, I encourage you, follow her on both of her Instagram accounts, follow her on TikTok, send her an email, and reach out to her about the private Facebook group. It's a super secret group, so you got to reach out to her to get in. So I encourage you to join that Facebook group in regards to her podcast. The information is scrolling below at the bottom of your screen. For my watchers and for my listeners, all of this information is in the description. So however you are taking in this episode, the information is at your fingertips. And while we're talking about a podcast, Sarah has a podcast. It is called Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. You can find it wherever you get your podcast. Sarah, I know we talked about a little bit. Tell us about your podcast.
Yeah, so Behind the Walls is my new podcast. It's been out for about a month and a half, and it features stories and kind of in-depth looks at different psychiatric hospitals. I focus mostly on the old mental asylums from like the turn of the century. So I have a 6-part series on Oregon State Hospital in Salem, Oregon. And then most recently, I have part 1 of 2 of the Fairview Training Center, also in Salem, Oregon, which used to be called the Oregon State Institution for the Feeble-Minded. So that was an institution and facility for folks with physical and mental disabilities. And then I'll be looking at the history of different hospitals, different asylums around the country and the world, and bringing those old stories back to life and showing what treatment was like back then, and maybe some stories about people who lived in those facilities. So I'm really excited by it. I'm learning a lot, and I hope you learn a lot too.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that information about your podcast. And to my audience, I encourage you to find her podcast, and I encourage you to subscribe. It is called Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Check it out on your favorite podcast station. All right. Well, Sarah, thank you again for coming to Hot Topics.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is fun. I could talk about this all day.
I can tell.
For better or for worse.
I can tell. All right, I'll place you backstage now. All right, you guys. Well, we have reached the conclusion of yet another episode. Thank you so much for joining me today. Let me get my information up here. All right, you guys. So I want to take this moment to remind you that Hot Topics is a production of my company, A Step Ahead Tutoring Services. So if you are looking for tutoring, whether it is for your child, whether it's for your neighbor, your auntie, your cousin, or your friend down the way, or even for yourself, right? If you are looking for a tutor, reach out to us. We offer one-on-one tutoring. We do test prep, college counseling, editing and proofreading, and we offer a variety of workshops as well, virtual workshops. So if you are looking for any of those services, homework help, time management. These are very common things that my tutors see. If you're looking for any of these things, reach out to us, reach out to the company. It is A Step Ahead Tutoring Services. Our website is www.astepaheadtutoringservices.com. You could also email us at success@astepaheadtutoringservices.com. You could also call or text us. Our number is 347-762-2838. And you can follow us on our multiple social media platforms. We're on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Twitter, and Eventbrite. So you can send us a direct message on any of those platforms if you need to reach out to us. While you're on social media, I encourage you to follow us on our multiple platforms. Follow us on these things. So if you're watching this on video or listening on audio, follow us on our multiple platforms. But yes, I will give our website again. It is www.astepaheadtutoringservices.com. So if you are looking for any academic help or homework help or any kind of self-confidence boost when it comes to school or anything, if you're a homeschooler, of the screen for my watchers and for my listeners, all of this information is in the description. So I encourage you to reach out to us today. And while I'm here, I also want to encourage you guys to leave your feedback about today's episode. Let me know what you thought about this episode today. Did you learn something? Was it educational? Give me your feedback, right? So, if you're watching this on video, drop a comment below. Drop a comment in the comment section, or, drop a comment in the thread. Let me know your thoughts about the episode for today. If you're a listener, if you're listening on, Stitcher or Spotify or Good Pods or Apple Podcasts, drop a rating. Drop a rating. Let us know your thoughts about the episode. Drop a comment, drop a rating, drop something. Just drop something, but let us know your feedback about the episode that you just watched today or you just listened. I know I'm like, wait, watch listening that you partook in. Let us know your feedback about the episode for today. I definitely will appreciate your feedback. So please drop a comment in the comment section or drop a rating. Let me know your thoughts about the episode today. All right, you guys, and that is it for the episode today. Thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to you joining me at the next episode. Thank you guys. And now I am signing off. Bye, you guys.